Good afternoon and welcome to The Appeal Live, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Emily Galvin-Almanza. So right now, the federal bench is disproportionately made up of people who at some point and in some capacity worked on behalf of the government. So prosecutors, for example, for every judge who was once a criminal defense attorney, like Thurgood Marshall, there are 4 judges who were prosecutors. And more broadly, for every judge who once represented human beings, people, in court against the government, there are 7 who spent their careers representing the government. So President Joe Biden has pledged to correct this imbalance and appoint public defenders, legal aid lawyers, civil rights lawyers to the bench. As his nominations for vacant seats come in, though, we're going to find out whether he intends to fulfill that promise. Our guest today is Chittenden County, Vermont State's Attorney Sarah Fairgeorge, a prosecutor who recently wrote for The Appeal about the urgent need to include more public defenders and other nominees with underrepresented career experiences in the pool of judicial nominees. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Emily.
All right, so let's start off with just like 2 really basic questions. Why are there so many prosecutors around here, and why is this so bad for the bench to be filled with federal prosecutors?
Yeah, they're great questions. So I, as a prosecutor, often talk about the fact that prosecutors are the most influential and powerful actors in the criminal legal system. Prosecutors make countless decisions about a particular case and therefore a particular person's life before it ever gets to a defense attorney or a judge. But historically, in many places, and frankly still, people within the community and within the legal system inherently believe that because of that power, prosecutors are therefore the most prestigious actors in our system, and therefore, frankly, more entitled to or more qualified for judgeship. That belief, I think, is what has led to a judiciary nationwide that is predominantly held by prior prosecutors. And the reason it's bad, there's a few main reasons that I see every day as a prosecutor, both locally and nationally. The lack of professional diversity on the bench has ensured basically that our courts can disproportionately reflect the viewpoints of the most powerful institutions and the most powerful people in our country. Those viewpoints mainly being that of other prosecutors and police and the Department of Corrections or the Bureau of Prisons in some jurisdictions. Prosecutors often maintain good relationships with the police as part of our work, and that means that prosecutors who then become judges take that experience and that mentality with them to the bench. That can have really grave implications for regulating law enforcement misconduct, holding police accountable. And that includes the near impossibility of suing law enforcement, police, and prosecutors for civil rights violations under a judge-made doctrine of qualified immunity. And further, prosecutors are trained to view public safety through a law and order lens. And that means policing and arresting and convicting and incarcerating and supervising, all in the name of victim and community safety. So when that evidence and data, or when evidence and data tells us the complete opposite is true, we're still putting people in our judiciary that don't listen to that. Public defenders have been screaming this from the rooftop for years, and prosecutors and judges haven't been listening. So that's why it's bad. Those viewpoints are narrow and frankly dangerous.
So I'm interested to hear your take. I think you've unpacked a lot, and we could spend an entire episode talking about, like, should prosecutors have such cozy relationships with law enforcement, even if they're not becoming judges? But focusing on the judge question here. When we talk about shifting those opportunities for judgeships over to public defenders and civil rights litigators, And I'm going to make a quick note here. I was a public defender for the better part of a decade, and I know that there are some really bad judges who used to be public defenders. So let's assume that what we're talking about here are people who are ideologically driven towards the values of increasing liberty and sticking up for the little guy. Let's assume that we're talking about ideologically driven public defenders who consider it their identity, not like people who become twisted on the bench. How does putting more of those folks in power help the judiciary?
Yeah. So public defenders and civil rights attorneys, by the nature of their professions, are required to consider the impact of the law on everyday people. Their jobs require them to understand the circumstances of marginalized groups and ensure that large institutions and systems don't strip them of their most basic rights. They spend their careers representing everyday people, hearing what led them to potentially commit a crime or engage in criminal behavior, and hearing the stories of those who are falsely accused, hearing them firsthand from the individual who was falsely accused and maybe even falsely convicted. They also see the harm to the individual and their families and their communities, often because of the government's failure to meet their most basic needs. They spend their careers attempting to convince the government that these individuals are also a part of our community and therefore need to be and deserve to be treated with the same respect and dignity of everybody else in the system. So by appointing more judges with this type of professional experience, that innate understanding of how the deck has been stacked against marginalized people in our country will undoubtedly influence their decisions as judges and start a trend of truly balancing those scales of justice.
So I'm wondering if you've seen any movement on this. We've seen Biden signal that he is in agreement, that he would try to address this issue. He and his team have called on senators to send him potential nominees with public defense experience. Have you seen movement on this? Are public defenders in your district like in contention? Like what signs of progress have you seen?
Yeah, I mean, I think the conversation is the biggest progress that I've seen so far. This is not the first time we've been talking about this even during this administration. It's definitely a thing we're talking about more. I don't know that we locally have any vacancies in Vermont, so I don't know if it's something that we have seen progress on locally. But I do compare it a lot to the movement within electing progressive prosecutors. And in that movement, I have seen a lot of public defender friends of mine who are starting to think about whether or not, the more they complain about elected state's attorneys, about whether or not maybe they should run or become prosecutors, become a part of this system that they think they, can fix from within. So I imagine that same conversation is going to start really ramping up within the judiciary. I would say that Vermont is also somewhat unbalanced in the opposite direction, and I'm grateful for that. We have a lot of prior public defenders on our bench. So, I think that this is a conversation Vermont has just been sort of ahead of the game on, and we're now starting to see it on a more national level.
So we have this new polling that's just out today that I'd love to talk with you a little bit about. So it's not just Vermont that might be into the idea of putting public defenders on the bench. New polling from the Appeal Lab and Data for Progress shows that nearly 2/3 of voters across the country, including in big jurisdictions where there's a lot of prosecutors on the bench, I can say having practiced there, like New York and New Jersey and California, these voters, this strong majority of voters, support their senators recommending public defenders and civil rights lawyers for nomination to the federal bench. How do you think this conversation has evolved over the last few months or even the last few years?
I would again compare a lot to the conversation around who we're electing as our district attorneys and our state's attorneys. Those polls don't surprise me, because when prosecutors are starting to run on reform and progressive agendas, they are often winning, and sometimes by overwhelming amounts. So it is clear to me that our communities are far ahead of our practice. And I was thrilled to see the Biden administration so quickly, specifically not just asking for underrepresented professions, but specifically naming public defenders, civil rights, and legal aid attorneys as people he wanted to see coming to him for names. I think that's huge. And I think that more polls like this would find the same thing, that people in our communities understand the value that public defenders and civil rights attorneys and legal aid attorneys bring to the table, and how that will ultimately impact our over incarceration problem, for lack of a better word, in this country. I think that the more we start talking about it and the more we explain why that vision and that experience is important, more and more people will undoubtedly support it.
So I want to dig into why this perspective is different. I remember during my time as a public defender, in speaking with prosecutors, it was almost appalling how little they knew about the community they were prosecuting. I spent my days talking with people and getting to know them and their stories and their life stories and their families. And it often felt like prosecutors were just living in a different world and totally detached from the realities in which most people were living. You in your article talk about mitigation. For those who don't know, mitigation is evidence you can present that talks about how a person came to be in the situation they're in, factors that might be relevant to understanding why they got in trouble or what they're struggling with, or what they might need in order to walk away from the system and succeed. So it's a way of looking at people's lives in court that is humanizing and usually decarceral, gets people out of jail and into better things. So you talk about how public defenders and civil rights attorneys are perhaps uniquely qualified to think about those factors as judges. I'd love for you to kind of delve into a minute how the public defender or civil rights litigator or legal aid perspective towards human beings is different, and what that means for their service on the bench.
Yeah, and so you hit a lot of the point that I think it's important to note that in most jurisdictions, judges have an incredible amount of discretion when imposing sentences. And again, a lot of really important decisions are made by prosecutors long before it gets to a judge, but the ultimate sentence imposed is up to a judge. But it's often the state's attorney or the prosecutor that is standing in a courtroom, pointing out and relying heavily on all of the aggravating factors to justify a harsher sentence. And the public defender in the courtroom highlighting and relying on all of the mitigating factors to justify a lesser sentence. Public defenders go into every sentencing and spend their entire careers attempting to convince the government that these individuals are also a part of the community, that those mitigating factors that they have accumulated in the time that they have grown to know their client, to know their client's family and every possible circumstance that led them to whatever situation they were in. Every part of that is to try to portray their client as the human being that they are, that mistake they made does not define them. They are not the worst thing that they have done. And to talk about likely their own victimization. Most people who are committing crimes have also been victims of crime. Talking about the marginalization and failures of our system. The more prosecutors who become judges, the more they are likely to focus constantly on aggravating circumstances and frankly ignore the mitigating ones. And when the opposite is true and public defenders become judges, they are more likely to understand the importance of those mitigating factors and frankly hold them higher than the aggravating ones, which is not what happens right now. I think that that's the most important. Having anybody that in itself, I think, would lead to lower sentences and an immense amount of decarceration, just because judges get it. They get that this isn't just a defense attorney coming in and trying to make up all of these excuses and justifications for their client committing whatever crime they did, which is how prosecutors often look at it, right? And that's how victims often see it. That's how the media often portrays it. These are all of the excuses. These are all of the justifications. Instead of it just being a story about a person, about a human being, it's a life, and all of the ways that our systems have failed them. And so incarcerating them is not the answer.
Okay, I want to dig into what you're saying here for a second, because I think that you and I could have a really good time getting into some like dirty secrets of what actually happens in court. And I think we should do it. Okay. So, you mentioned a few of these sort of endemic problems with the way most prosecutors' offices operate. And I'm not talking about the ones that are headed by, sort of torchbearer reformers or public defenders who ran for office, or like I'm talking about the old school offices that are still watching like 1990s reruns of Law and Order and like thinking that's the world. So you mentioned not seeing people accused of crimes as being part of the community they are tasked with protecting. You mentioned the incentives in the system of going for the harshest punishment possible or the most days in jail, and like getting promotions literally based on locking people in cages. So what I'm wondering is, since you and I both know that so much of what happens in the outcome of a criminal case happens without the judge there, it's negotiations between the defense and prosecutors, it's what the prosecutor, who has so much power in the system, is willing to give or willing to listen to or willing to pay attention to. Can you drill down for a minute on how the judge can influence prosecutorial practice and culture? Like, what can putting a public defender on the bench do to make those backroom conversations have better outcomes for ordinary people?
Yeah, I mean, a couple things. I think one of the biggest things is being more vocal. Well, when they're making particular decisions about a sentence, for example, but actually even backing up, I recently announced that my office was not going to seek cash bail. About a year ago now. But that policy is only as good as the judge we're in front of, because the judges still have discretion to set cash bail. So one thing that we understand in my office every day is when we're in front of a judge that used to be a public defender, we're not going to have to fight as hard to not have bail imposed. But when we're in front of a judge that was a prior prosecutor, or frankly, even a private defense attorney, we're going to have to put up a lot more of a fight and justify why cash bail is ransom and why we are not going to ask for it anymore. So I think when you have a judge in those positions, not only can they make those decisions quicker, but they also can be vocal about why they're not doing it. We have had judges who have said they are excited about our policy, that they will not set cash bail. We have also had judges who have vocally said that they will continue to set cash bail despite our policy. So that's one way that experience in real practice, and really early, I mean, that's the day somebody's being arraigned, that a judge is having a massive influence on whether that person sits in jail while their case is pending or not. And the more vocal they are about it, especially if the media is there, or if members of the community are there, the more they start to see, okay, this isn't just this crazy progressive prosecutor making this dangerous policy. This is people who have become judges who also think that cash bail is not appropriate. So that's one way. And that does go throughout the system, or throughout the process, down to sentencing. I think when judges are imposing sentences, being much more vocal about why they aren't asking or why they are not imposing a crazy amount of jail. I think that in itself can be really important. Another policy that I implemented was that we no longer call defendants. We call them by their name. And that's in filings and in court. That is a hard practice to change when you were a career prosecutor. But all of the public defenders I've hired, that's not hard for them. And so when we start talking about them as human beings, the judges, I've seen when I call an offender by their first, or by their Mr. or by their name, a judge will do it after me. It permeates through the system so that it's not all on the public defender in the courtroom to do and to humanize this individual and make it look like they're just making excuses for them.
Language is so important, and it's so hard to break habits. I mean,
it is.
I assume you're trying to roust out the word offender as well.
Yes, I am. It is. And you know what I also do? I put a lot of blame on prosecutors, but I didn't learn to call somebody a defendant or an offender when I became a prosecutor. I learned that in law school. I learned that in trial practice. So this goes way beyond just you become a prosecutor and you're trained to dehumanize people. This is our entire society trains us to do it. Law and Order trains you to do it. Law school trains you to do it.
We're coming for Dick Wolf.
Right, yes.
All right, I want to talk with you about the Supreme Court. We have just a few minutes left, but I want to talk with you for that little bit of time about the highest court in the land. So Joe Biden is reportedly considering D.C. District Court Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson to replace Merrick Garland on the D.C. Circuit, which is, of course, the nation's second most powerful court. And on the campaign trail, Biden promised to put a Black woman on the Supreme Court. And among the rumored frontrunners for that position are Judge Jackson and California Supreme Court Justice Leandra Kruger, who has a background as a corporate attorney and prosecutor. Now, just to reflect on the history of the Supreme Court here, the last civil rights lawyer on the Supreme Court was, of course, RBG. Yeah. But the last time there was a criminal defense lawyer on the Supreme Court was like 30 years ago. It was Thurgood Marshall, who stepped down in 1991. So when we're hearing these names floated based on other identity factors and lived experience factors, which are, of course, very, very important, but which lack that key characteristic and that key perspective that you and I have been unpacking now for quite some time, what are the stakes here? Like, how would a Supreme Court justice with criminal defense experience change the way the Supreme Court handles or engages with criminal law matters?
Yeah, it's frankly hard to put into words how big of an impact that could have. The fact that our Supreme Court, or that we have never had a Supreme Court justice who has been solely a public defender, is crazy to me. This means that our country's highest court has never, including currently, had a member who has represented our most vulnerable, most indigent, and frankly, most desperate community members. When the Supreme Court, for example, is hearing a death penalty case, and nobody on the bench, let alone the majority of the people on the bench, have ever represented a human being on death row, that's a problem. Your outcomes are always going to be unbalanced. There's no way that a Supreme Court who has never represented a person on death row, sat in a room with a person who believes they are going to die, can possibly have an opinion that has some humanization to it. It is always going to be about law, which frankly is just not always the case. Sometimes there has to be a humanization factor to our decisions, a moral factor to our decisions that is just not happening right now. Every decision that has come from our Supreme Court has been missing this integral perspective that cannot be ignored, and it also can't be adopted. I like to think that because I'm a progressive prosecutor, I understand these things, and I do, but I will never understand it in the same way that somebody who practices as a public defender will. You can't adopt it to the same level. You have to really have been in these positions and had these conversations with people and their families and seen the desperation and fear that they live with every single day to really be able to implement policies and laws that matter.
I'm really glad you brought up the human nature of the system. After all, our founders constructed this system that is made up of humans, of human jurors, of human judges. I'm really glad that you brought the humanity into the law, because we can't. So often the instinct dating back to law school is to excise humanity from legal judgment. And you're right that that's a hugely important perspective. So Sarah, thank you so much for joining us. It has been a joy having you here on the Appeal Live. We are looking forward to seeing you again very soon, I hope.
Thank you, Emily. It's been great. Nice to meet you.
So advocates working to end mass incarceration are calling for fundamental changes to the composition of our judiciary, which is super lopsided, super heavy on lawyers with prosecutorial and government experience. President Biden, of course, has signaled that he is listening. He wants to correct the imbalance by putting people with public defense and civil rights and legal aid experience on the bench. The outlook they would bring to the job would transform the way they practice and the way people around them practice, including their understanding of the deep humanity of people who are impacted by this system. Could make a world of difference in making courtrooms fair and more accessible for everyone. So now you and I, dear viewers, are going to have to keep our eyes on President Biden to see what he chooses to do. That's all the time we have today. This has been another episode of The Appeal Live. I'm Emily Galvin Almanza. You can follow us on The Appeal News on Facebook. You can follow us at The Appeal on Twitter. And we look forward to seeing you again soon.